Well, I lied. On video 4, I told you it was the last one, but this is actually the last video for the skeletal system and joints. You actually had mission 5 was the joints, but I decided since there was a small amount of material for that to just combine it with the skeleton because they do work together and you're talking about joints, which is not the kind you smoke, but the location where bones meet is what we are going to talk about that. So I combined it with that and decided to add this one last video. So that's what this video is about, are the joints, where the location where bones meet. So you do have these two diagrams in your digital notebook. So if you'll turn to this one first, and notice in your digital notebook, it has draggable boxes this time. Did that to kind of save you some time. Instead of typing stuff in, you can just find the box that matches and drag it to the correct location. Now you will be using this information in one of your activities in the mission module, so be sure you have these correct. There's two boxes. There's one up here already in place that are talking about these connective tissues involved in joints. And we talked about those when we did the tissue biopsy thing. You saw some pictures of those, but tendons are connective tissues that will join a bone to a muscle. And I'll show you some in just a minute on a model. And then ligaments are connective tissue that joins bones to bones. So two different kinds. They're basically the same type of connective tissue with a few extra small differences, but nothing really huge. So go ahead and add those boxes in the top of the notes here. And then we'll look at the three different kinds of joints. The first kind is called a fibrous joint. So think of, if something is fibrous, it means it has a lot of fibers to it. When you eat some sugar cane or stuff that has lots of those little fibers, you can feel those in the stringy stuff. Or if you eat celery, that's a good example of something that's fibrous. So a fibrous joint, this is the box that goes with that. It means if it's a fibrous joint, that means there's some fibers that kind of hold it together, the two bones together, not necessarily a ligament, but more of these little fibers. They are immovable. That means they don't move or just slightly movable. Held together by fibrous tissue that I just mentioned. And these joints also have a functional category as far as what type of movement is allowed. And this one is called a synarthrosis. Synarthrosis. There's a picture over here that shows you an example of where you'd find this kind of joint. And focus on this one up here. This is a circle highlighting these sutures at where your bones meet. So let me get this. This is a model of a skull, human skull, adult skull. Now, in case you didn't know it, babies are born and the skull bones do not meet. And as you get older, these bones will meet, but they don't completely fuse and meet up. You can't really see the thing. Let me see if I can change my light. You can see them a little better here. So they don't actually fuse until you're in your 30s completely. So this suture right here, that's the line where those bones grew together. That is an example of a synarthrosis or a fibrous joint. So the fibrous material between this area where the two bones meet, that's the fibrous tissue they're talking about in the description of this joint. So all of these different lines on a skull, that's where the bones eventually grew together and met. In infants, when they're first born, you can feel a soft spot on the top of their skull, and that's there because the bones have not grown together at all. So the main one is right here at the front, and then there's another one at the back. The last one to completely fuse is this front. It's called the anterior fontanelle. So this is synarthrosis, fibrous type of joint. The next type, and these categories are structural. The structure is how they categorize that. The cartilaginous joint is immovable or slightly movable, just like a fibrous. except these are held together with some sort of cartilage. So there's fibrocartilage and hyaline cartilage differences. And so the place where you find those are between your ribs and the sternum, where the ribs are connected to the sternum, and then between your vertebrae. So let me get those examples. I'll use Henry here. Get you closer up here. So this is a sternum. This is your sternum right here. And so switch this out. Here are the ribs. Right here, all the ribs. And this clear stuff right here is the cartilage that holds the rib, that connects the ribs to the sternum. So this location here where the bones meet, where the rib bone meets the sternum bone, this is the joint that we're talking about. Now, this one is a little bit more movable than the one in the skull. And that kind of makes sense when you think about the organs that are underneath the rib cage. What are those again? Yes, the heart and the lungs. So when you're breathing and your heart is beating, this does need to move some, the rib cage, and do it on yourself. Just hold your ribs while you're breathing in and out. And you can feel how your chest cavity expands, which you kind of have to do to make sure you get plenty of oxygen in your lungs. Well, that's because you have some slight movement at this joint. This is, since there is more movement than not, there it's called amphiarthrosis, kind of like an amphibian can live and land in water. That's why it's called amphiarthrosis. The backbone here, the other type of example, I don't know if you can see this very well, but right, let me turn this around, George, around here. You can't really see it here, but there are discs of cartilage between your vertebrae, and when you bend and do different movements with your vertebrae, that's where that joint is, where it's holding those two together, at those two bones, the two vertebrae. So that is your cartilaginous joint. And then the other type, the structural category is synovial because of the structures that are in that joint. And then the functional category is called diarthrosis because there are actually it goes in two planes of movement. So these are freely movable joints. They contain synovial fluid to make sure that the movement is frictionless. You don't have bones rubbing together. That would be very painful. And then they contain nerve fibers and blood vessels within the joint cavity. And the functional category is diarthrosis because it involves movement in two different planes. So these are the joints that allow you to bend your elbow like this, your knee, your feet, your ankle, your wrist, these movements, nodding, moving your head this way, twisting, lifting your whole leg and shrugging your shoulders. These are all movements that are allowed because of this synovial joint. Let me go ahead and show you this here. Okay, so this is a model of a knee joint, and this is very commonly injured if you're an athlete because of all the different things that can go wrong. This is your femur. This is the distal end of your femur. Remember, distal means far from the point of attachment, and the point of attachment of your leg is your hip. So this end of the femur is far away from the top part. So this is the distal end. And then this is the proximal end of your tibia. This end of the tibia is closer to the joint, the hip, than the bottom part of the tibia is. So this is the distal end of the tibia. And inside here, you see that bone right there. That's the kneecap or the patella. That's an example of the sesamoid bone that we talked about in the classification of bone video. So you see this, what kind of this color of material. This is something that is connecting the patella with a muscle up here. So since this is connecting muscle to bone, this is a tendon. Then this down here is connecting the patella, a bone, with the tibia, another bone. So this is actually a ligament. So that's how you tell the difference on a model between the tendons and the ligaments. The tendons are connecting muscles, the ligaments are connecting two bones together. You also have one of these structures connecting your femur with the tibia. So that would be which one, a ligament or a tendon? Yes, this is a ligament. And then this also would be a ligament because it's connecting the two bones together. Another structure I want to show you, just because it's commonly heard, especially if you're an athlete, right here between the bones, between the femur and the tibia, you have this little pads of connective tissue. These are called menisci. It's plural. Meniscus is singular. You can see them better on the posterior view of the knee joint. So if you have a meniscus that's torn, you ever had a torn meniscus? This is what you're tearing. You're tearing the connective tissue that helps protect the ends of these bones. It's like a cushion pad, because think about all the movement you do. This is a very active joint at your knee. And so you need something there to reduce friction. If these bones are rubbing against each other, that is very painful. And if you've had a torn meniscus, you know how painful that is. Or people that have arthritis have an inflammation of this joint, or you may have other damage to the ligaments and tendons that cause a lot of pain there. One last thing I want to show you, and this is kind of a preview to our muscular system, but I'm going to hold it this way. I told you that this is a tendon. It's connected to your quadriceps muscle, which is the front of your thigh. And pretend like my hand that I'm waving here. This is the muscle. When this muscle contracts, when muscles contract, they pull on the tendon here, and the tendons, the other end of it is connected to a bone. We talked about how the skeletal system serves as a lever, and I mentioned to you that you can have bones, but if you don't have muscles, you can't move. And the same is true. If you have muscles but no bones, you can't move either, because they work together. And this is how they do that. This is the muscle again, and it's connected to the tendon. The other end of the tendon is the patella, and then eventually here, and then the tibia. So this is how your leg extends. When this muscle contracts, look what happens to the other side of the bone. Okay, this is like I'm extending my leg at the knee. If you're sitting there in the weight room and you're sitting there and you've got your feet wrapped around that one end of the weight machine, when you contract this would be you sitting. When you contract that muscle, you're extending your foot. So this is how tendons and ligaments work with muscles and bones to help you do the different movements that you do. Okay? Okay, go on then. The next diagram you have is details about the synovial joints. These are your more commonly known ones, and they have a bunch of different categories. So look at the next diagram you have are the synovial joints, and it shows you kind of, if you had machine parts, this is kind of what these diagrams are to demonstrate the different kinds of synovial joints. And it shows you its point here. You see this dotted line and it has a square around it. That's the location of these different joints. On your diagram, you have draggable boxes to label the different ones. So as I go through them here, go ahead and drag yours over to the right picture. We're going to start at the top left. That is an example of a pivot joint. If you're pivoting, if you are in marching band or you do dance, you kind of know what a pivot is. Pivot is when you're doing this and then you do this. So this kind of joint is found in the upper neck bones. And this is what allows you to do your head like this. So saying no is because of this pivot joint that you have in your vertebrae. Let's see if I can get him over here. Okay, and so you can't really see the neck joints, but I'm talking about these two, their first two vertebrae, the C1 and C2 is what those are. And so your ability to do this is because of that pivot joint that's between those two bones there. The next one is called a hinge joint, and I just showed you with the knee as an example of a hinge joint. and I showed you that model. This one is highlighting the other location of a hinge joint in your body is your elbow. So the same kind of movement, you're doing this like that. And it's called a hinge joint because it's like the hinge of a door. Go look at a door and see where it attaches to the frame. There's that metal plate, and it's a hinge that allows movement in these up and down kind of movements. Okay, that's a hinge joint. The next one is called a ball and socket joint. This is the one that actually allows the most type of movement. It's also the one that is the most able to, there's a lot of injury here. Okay, so ball and socket joint, just think about a ball, and a socket looks like this, and so it fits in there like this. And this can give you all kinds of rotational movements, as well as just the hinge is this just one up and down, back and forth movement. The ball and socket can give you rotational movements as well. And so this one is highlighting your hip. So take your leg out and just move it all the different directions you can with your leg are because of this ball and socket joint. Where would another one be in your body? If this in your hip is the ball and socket, think about one other place where you can get that same kind of rotational movement. Yes, that would be your shoulder. So take your shoulder and all of those movements that you can do back and forth, all the rotations you do. If you are a pitcher, especially softball pitcher, you're doing that rotational movement all the time to throw that pitch in. And it's the same with baseball. You're doing all these kinds of technical movements with your ball and socket joint. The next one over is a gliding or a plane joint. Remember, a plane is just a flat surface we talked about with the sagittal, frontal, and those transverse planes. Well, here's a plane, and then the other bone would just slide across the surface of the plane. An example there is the bones between the ankles, the ankle bones there. And those are called tarsals. You'll learn all these bones during this unit. And so here's an ankle. Okay, here's a foot. Sorry. Here's the ankle bones here. And so all of these, if you look at them closely, you can see that it's just one flat surface against another flat surface like it shows here. And so just the ways that your ankle can, think about how you move your ankle, and those bones between there are an example of a gliding or a plane joint. The next one up is called a condylar joint. This is between the radius, which is one of your lower arm bones, and your carpal bones, which are in your wrist. So I'm going to show you this angle. The radius is this bone. When you're standing in anatomical position, it's on the thumb side of your arm. So here's the thumb right here. So this bone is the radius. It's called that because the very end of it has this round knob. Okay, so this is the radius. So between your radius and your carpal bone here, these are the bones of your wrist, the carpals. That's the condylar joint. This is the kind of movement that allows you to wave your hand like this and move it up and down. And the last one is called a saddle joint. And it's called that because of the structure of the bone. You can see it looks kind of like a saddle of a horse if you're going to ride a horse. And you find this is a very important joint for human beings because you find this between your thumb, which is your first metacarpal bone, and your carpal bone of your wrist. This is what gives you what's called an opposable thumb. So here's your thumb. And I can't move it because it's wired together. But right here is your saddle joint. And you can kind of see how it looks like the saddle right there. And this type of joint allows you to move your thumb like this. Okay, we are the only ones that have this, an opposable thumb, which allows us to grab, which allows us to grab and hold tools. Other animals don't have this, just primates. Okay, that is the end of the joints video. And so I promise you, this is the last video for this mission of the skeletal system and joints. And so once you finish these, you can do a quick vocab check with Quizlet and take your pre-assessment launch.